how hard it was for me to find all this information about gaining wealth, buying businesses. What does that tell you about the traditional education system? And is the traditional education system training us to be poor?
Yeah. I think we were sold a lot of lies about the education system. If you just look at the data today, what's happening in the university system today? Well, it's 3 to 4x in price, our generation versus our parents' generation, at a simultaneous moment of the value basically decreasing. So we make less money when we graduate, but they charge us 3 to 4x more. Huge issue. And then on top of that, we have the education systems, by and large, teaching us varying professions that aren't immediately applicable. And they say, if you really want to go and be in business, not only do you have to do 4 years, but you better do that MBA, which has a nice cost of, let's call it 30K on the low end and 75, 100, and 120 on the high end. We've created these like money printing machines that are universities, but they're certainly not money making for the students. They are for the universities. And a perfect case is that we've let them become hedge funds. So these universities now, even like the state universities, which didn't used to have huge pensions and endowments, now do. And so if you look at some of the largest pensions in the world that have cash, it's the university systems. And that doesn't mean the university systems are bad for that. They've found an incredible way to make money. Here's the problem. Your parents' tax dollars go to those university systems. And yet, if you want to default on your university loan, you can't. It's going to follow you around for the rest of your life. And so I had a real problem with a lot of how traditional university systems work. And I had a pretty big problem with the idea that, like, why is it also that if I was to ask you, like, what do you think of somebody who sells a course online? What would you say? You'd be like, oh, right? Because we've all kind of seen over the years the whatever that is, the scammy titles, et cetera. But I think it's deeper than that. It's that we've actually said that we only trust these institutions, which numerically do not appear to be helping us, to teach us. And we don't want to go to practitioners who have actually done the thing. We want to go to theorists and academics who have thought about potentially doing a thing and not actually done it. And so I'm pushing back pretty hard on the university system overall because, man, if I had learned M&A earlier in my career, it's not that I didn't benefit and have a lot of fun going to liberal arts school for undergrad, ASU, or going to Georgetown for grad school. I did. But do I think the ROI was worth it if I had to pay for it all? The answer is no. I went to state school and I got a grant to go to school. And for Georgetown, my business paid for it. And so otherwise, I wouldn't spend $160,000, which is what I think the executive MBA program was.
Yeah.
Right. And no shame to my alma mater. They're all playing the same game. But that's why we're building something called the Contrarian Academy. And it's all about this idea of, like, how can we democratize access to the things that really make people wealthy? Yeah. And it's not like a Codie show. I don't even run the day-to-day academy. It's actually exactly what school should be. Office hours with experts and facilitators, ambassadors in each individual area so that people can have a commercial real estate expert in tandem with a small business sector expert. I don't know. So I often wonder, how did we get here?
Yeah, it's funny. And it's unfortunate with a lot of these business programs is because you're sold the hype, you're sold the hope of getting a job, of increasing your wage. And it's not until you actually graduate until you realize afterwards that this actually wasn't really worth it for most people. Robert Kiyosaki was on the show a few years ago and he was talking about the origins of how our current education system was built. And it was fascinating because it started in Prussia, actually, somewhere in the 1800s when Prussia lost the war to Napoleon. And what they did was they restructured their entire education system because they needed more soldiers that are obedient, disciplined, that could follow orders. And the American and Europeans actually took that model because it was so successful. And which is a little bit scary because it just means that the current education system, which still exists today to a lot of the forms, was built to build soldiers, not creators. And it was like such a fascinating moment for me to hear that. And it tells you a lot just based on what you're saying, that we need a new model. We can't really rely on this factory-built system that was meant to create soldiers.
That's fascinating. I had no idea.
Yeah, I had no idea either.
And I mean, I think we also have to be honest about the fact that if right now in the US, you do not have a college degree, on average, you will make less money than somebody that does have a college degree. That is true. Like on average, the numbers don't lie. And if you go to a graduate business degree, on average, you make more than if you only have an undergraduate degree, although not by much. Now, I think that is a little misleading, though, because in the future, I do think trades, and a trade might be coding, let's say, or engineering, as opposed to a full spectrum, liberal arts degree, which we typically think of in universities, they'll actually probably make more than a 4-year grad from a traditional university system. So people on the internet always go, but you did it. What are you going to do with your kids? And I guess my point is, like, you should do whatever you want and think that is correct for you, but maybe let's go in with eyes wide open. And so at least we know we can't just expect the universities to do it all. Yeah. We better simultaneously learn a few things that could actually drive real income into our profit, into our pockets. And I don't know why, but they don't teach things like the cash flow quadrant. They don't teach things like how to do acquisitions unless you go to a specific degree. And even then they teach you like how Google acquires $100 million transaction. They don't teach you how to individually at a small scale acquire it yourself.
And how much of it do you think is a lack of information? Because, with ChatGPT, Google, like you could technically get through that information. So that information is there somewhere around the web. But a lot of people are still struggling financially with their wealth. Is it really a lack of information, you think? Or do you think there's a risk appetite? Maybe perhaps people are just not wired to take certain risks, or they're just not willing to go through the information that's out there. What do you think it is? There's still a gap there, right?
That's a great point. Well, one, we do see by and large that the youth is taking less risk, right? We've seen studies that show we're getting married later, we're having less sex, we're in less committed partnerships, we're actually doing more startups, but shorter tenure of the startups. Like we start, we kind of don't continue. And less risky activities such as drinking, smoking. Some of that's good theoretically, but by and large, the difference between an adult and a child is one is allowed to take risk. Like adults, you say, no, that's your decision. You are allowed to go do that. Yeah. And if we have a nation of people who do not take risks, it is a nation of children. And so I think that is problematic. But simultaneously, it's scary, this idea of ownership. What does it mean? It means at the end of the day, whatever happens, that's on you. Can't blame anybody else. Can't call anybody else late at night and try to shift what happens. Can't go back to your boss and say, meh. It's like, it's you against you. And increasingly in which we have a society where there's so many people that want to shift blame, I do imagine that drives, some people to not take ownership. But here's the problem. The number one indicator for if you will be a millionaire or not, let's say that's something that you want to be, is do you have ownership? 60% of all millionaires own a business. 60%. And it's not just enough to own the stock market, really, although that would also be great. But problematically, in the stock market today, we have a lot of people. We have one of the highest levels of individuals owning stock that we've ever had, somewhere between 60 and 80%, depending how you splice it, own stock. Problem is, 80% of all outstanding stock is held by somewhere between the top 10 and 1%.
Wow. Yeah.
So really, the bottom 20% owns like nothing. They own no, if you're less than the top 20% of the society, so the rest of the 80%, you basically own no real amount of stock.
Yeah.
And so we don't even own stock, which would be one type of ownership. And we don't own businesses. Only 6% of Americans own a small business. In fact, Canadians own more small businesses than we do on average, 7% versus 6%. And so that's the problem. If you want to become a millionaire, you need ownership, except we don't own anything anymore. But you know who's making up for it? Private equity. So those guys go from owning 4% of the country's businesses in 2000 to 20% by 2020. So, they drive something like they own companies that drive 6.5% of US GDP. And so we have the few owning everything. And it's not that they're evil or bad. They're not. We know these guys. I was one of them. It's just that anytime the few own everything, it never ends well. So I think people don't want to do it because they're scared of ownership, but they want to be a millionaire. They want to have freedom. They want to have more security, maybe even, with being able to earn even when they're not working. But the only way to do that is to take risk and to take action. And if you don't do that, you're going to be broke forever.
I want to get your thoughts on this. There's